Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God.
So we're in the Gospel of Matthew still. We're looking at the King and His kingdom. Matthew's been taking us through a section with where he's setting the stage for the building of the conflict with the Pharisees. And he's building the pedigree, if you will, of Jesus. You know, we've seen Jesus raise the dead, perform miracles, heal the sick, cast out demons, all things that the Messiah will do. Through all of this, we've seen Jesus tell people that he's healed or cast out demons to not tell anyone. Because Jesus was reminding his disciples that they're special and I want to train you. Specifically 12 disciples, which is where we find ourselves in the gospel this morning. In our text this morning, we find Jesus specifically commissioning 12 of his disciples to accomplish ministry on his behalf. So the title of our message this morning is Representing the King. They're going to be appointed by him, and they will become apostles. And we'll see what that means. This first section we're going to look at this morning is the 12 apostles. The first 4 verses of chapter 10 provide for us a picture of the men called by Jesus to be his representatives and part of the foundation of the church. Remember, later on, the Apostle Paul would talk about those apostles, along with Jesus, are the foundation of the church. Everything that we do, everything that we learn is based on them, based on their back, on what they learned, what they taught. And so they become the foundation of the church. But before we can read chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, we got to remember where we are and what's going on. So we have to go back to chapter 9, verses 37 and 38. 9:37, then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." We saw last week that Jesus was showing compassion on the people of Israel as he traveled, particularly through Galilee. He was moved with compassion for those that were sick and dying and those that didn't know him. And so as he's looking out at the fresh fields growing grain, he says, you know, there's a lot of people that need help. There's just not a lot of laborers. So pray to the Lord of the harvest. Who's that? That's Jesus. Pray to Jesus that he will send out more laborers. That's a prayer we discovered last week that belongs to us as well. We need to be praying for more laborers, more people that are going out spreading the good news of the gospel. And the very next thing that Matthew writes, maybe not the next thing that happened in time, but the next thing that he writes then is, "And he called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction." As I look at this verse, I first see that there's something specific about the 12. Jesus called his 12 disciples. We know that Jesus had hundreds, even thousands of people following him. He would set up to start teaching, and what would happen? The crowds would come along. We know there were thousands because he fed them a couple of times. So you can just imagine the throngs of people coming around him. Often we read he had to get away from the crowd. In his humanity, he just had to decompress for a while. But in this verse we see in Jesus, and he called them his 12, he called to him his 12 disciples. These were 12 specifically called by Jesus? We already saw the action of calling them, where Jesus said to Matthew as he's sitting in the tax collector's office, "Hey, Matthew, come on, let's go, follow me." Or Peter, "I'll make you fishers of men," instead of fishers of fish. These 12 are specifically called. The grammar of this verse seems to indicate that the 12 had already been formed. Matthew's talking about it now, but it seems like this group of 12 had already been established as a subgroup of the disciples. Matthew's been calling them disciples, and they're all disciples, but it seems like they've been segmented from the rest of the group. And Jesus calls them to be with him at times when he doesn't have the rest with him. Within the group of 12, we see a smaller inner circle of 3 men, Peter, James, and John. I always find it interesting to look at the men that Jesus selected to be his chosen followers, his first followers, his most important followers, his apostles. I find it fascinating to look at who these men are. If you want to wander down that path sometime, get Dr. MacArthur's book, 12 Ordinary Men. He goes a long way into providing an insight into who these guys are, what their personalities are from what we know of the Gospels. You see Peter, the hothead, as lots of people have called him, the preacher with a foot-shaped mouth, because he's just that rambunctious, right? He jumps into something before he thinks about it. Or Judas Iscariot, not really a follower toward the end. Somebody trusted, but not a follower. You often think, Jesus is omniscient. He knows everything. And yet he chose some of these goofballs. Some of these personalities that we would say, yeah, maybe that's not the best guy to have as the foundation of your church. But those are the men that Jesus chose for a reason. And I find that interplay between the 12 and Jesus fascinating. The book 12 Ordinary Men goes a long way to giving you that kind of insert. I find it intriguing that Jesus picked the men that he picked, knowing who they were and what they would be. And then toward the end, what happened? All 12, with the exception of John, who was standing a little ways off, all 12 fled. Peter even cursed out a little girl who said, yeah, you were there. You know who he is. They all fled. They didn't want anything to do with it when Jesus was arrested. Judas actually was a traitor and turned him in. I'm fascinated that Jesus would select those men. Why did he do that? What did he see that we don't see? I think the answer to that is he saw his power. And he saw his ability to work with them. And yet, he still lost some, didn't he? Judas was a lost cause. Judas was a traitor, and if we can read into what Jesus called him, the son of perdition, he was not a saved individual. I think there was probably some pain associated with that for Jesus, as Judas came up and kissed him to signify this is the one to whom you're to arrest. Jesus realized that he lost him. Probably knew that he never had him. I understand that. I take it personally when we lose someone. I feel that deeply. It hurts. I can imagine what Jesus felt like. Then I study Jesus and his disciples. I watch the coming and going of people, and then I study Jesus and his disciples, and I see what Jesus went through with men personally chosen by him. Yet when the time came for them to stand up, they didn't. Not until after his death, burial, and resurrection. Then they stood proud for him. They all died for him, with the exception of John. Working against him to have him arrested, Judas was a traitor. I recognize that I should accept the same thing that Jesus did. People are going to be people. They're going to do what they did. They're going to do what they do. Jesus specifically calls these men to be his closest teammates. He says, I want you to be my closest people that will represent me. And then he gives them authority over the spiritual world and over the physical world. Look what it says. And he called them his 12 disciples, and he gave them authority over unclean spirits, that's the spiritual world, to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. That's the physical world. He gives these 12, including Judas, the power to go out and do these miracles that he's been doing. First, notice that Jesus gives those he calls authority. It's his authority, given to whom he chooses. He's not giving us our authority, it's his authority. The word authority here means that Jesus was giving the disciples the right to control, the power to control. Think about that for a moment. These 12 men were given the right and the power to control both the physical world and the spiritual world. Heal the sick, cast out demons. That's really a big deal. Jesus has been demonstrating his power and authority, and now he's giving it to his disciples. What have the last 3 chapters been all about? Jesus healing, and Jesus raising the dead and cleansing the lepers. Power over the physical and the spiritual world. And now he said, here, you do it. He's giving them that power. Second, we should see that the authority and power he's giving them is his meaning that they are working under his authority. They have no authority of their own. Jesus says, I give you my power. You don't have this power. I'm giving it to you to use. We'll learn later from the Apostle Paul, who was not part of this group, but the authority and power that we receive is so that we can accomplish the things Jesus wants us to accomplish. It's a big deal for us to understand. Everything you do as a follower of Jesus, as his disciple, is under his authority and under his power. You don't bring anything to the table. It's his power and his authority for the work that gets accomplished. It's not uncommon for people to look at a big church and say, wow, that preacher is really good. All the time it happens. Wow, they're really good musicians. Look at the praise band that they have. People just flock to see them. That's not what Jesus intends. He intends for us to work under his power and his authority, not our own abilities, under his power and his authority. In reality, if it's true worship, it's God that does it and not us. We work in his power and under his authority. Anything done under our power and our authority will fail. That's not a new teaching. That's even non-followers of Jesus at Jesus' time understood that. Gamaliel, Paul's instructor, mentor, said, look, if this is from God, you can't stop it, and if it's not, it'll fail. That's the reality. He understood the reality of what was going on. You can no more give credit for the house being built to the hammer than you can take credit for the kingdom being built. That carpenter goes in to build that house with a hammer, the hammer gets no credit. You're a hammer, or you're a nail, or you're a pry bar, or you're a saw, or you're a broom. Whatever you are, You get no credit. It all goes to him. That's the way that we're to work. And he called them his 12 disciples, and he gave to them authority. It's not that they had it their own selves. The names of the 12 apostles were these first: Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Every place you look at a listing of the apostles, you're going to find a couple of things. They always start with Peter and they always end with Judas. What do you make of that? What do you do with that? Was Peter their leader? Not specifically that we know of. But every one of them talks about Peter first, jumbles up the middle, and then Judas Iscariot last. But this is the only place in the Gospel of Matthew that one particular word is used. The names of the 12 apostles. What's apostles? The English word apostle is simply a transliteration of the Greek word apostolon or apostolos. The origin of the Greek word apostolon is kind of shaded. We're not really sure where it comes from. The most use of it is in Navy terms. We believe it comes from a root word that's part of a ship. It's believed by many that the origin of the word comes from the Greek Navy and the force they would send out from the ship. We have in our country a Navy and we have Marines. What do the Marines do? They are the force that is sent out from the naval ship to do something, to conquer an area, or originally they were to take on the Tripoli pirates in Libya. That's what they were created for. Because the Navy needed their guys on board the boat to run the boat. And so they needed to have an expeditionary force, the Marine Corps. The Marines are apostles. That force being sent out from the ship. That's where we believe the word comes from. It's used in the New Testament to speak of someone who is commissioned or sent with authority of the sender as an official representative. Ambassador, in our modern parlance, is the best word to describe what an apostle is. When an ambassador is appointed by the president, they go and represent the president and the president's desires for the country to another country. Without the president's seal, they can do nothing. So here in verse 2, it's the only place that the Gospel of Matthew refers to these as apostles. We believe that the group had already been formed before this, separate from the rank and file disciples, but here Jesus calls them apostles, or Matthew calls them apostles. I think Matthew uses this word here specifically because Jesus was sending them out as his representative. They were being sent by him, 2 by 2, we read in Luke, that they were being sent out as representatives of Jesus. Jesus just had given them authority over the physical and spiritual world and was sending them out. That's the definition of apostle. Matthew uses the noun for the group, and he does not do it again. We also see in verse 2 something very intriguing to me. He says, first Simon, who is called Peter. What does his first mean here? Most scholars say that first here only means the first in the list, but he's the first in every list, which to me says something. Every listing of in the New Testament of the 12 apostles begins with Simon, Peter, and ends with Judas Iscariot. To me, that seems to denote some sort of order. The most important to the least important. You know, Matthew's writing this 30 years after Judas betrayed Jesus. And so he's looking back, and obviously Judas is going to go last because he was a turncoat. He was the bad guy. But why does every time we have a list is Peter put first? I think it's safe to say that Matthew was not ascribing to Peter any authoritative role. But Peter really was the leader of the 12 after Jesus. I don't think you can really escape that. His personality was such that he couldn't you just can't get away from that. Because when Jesus says something, who's the first to open his mouth? Peter. He's a type A plus personality, and he's just going to jump in the middle. And so I think it's just normal when you talk about the apostles that Peter is at the top of the list. I don't think you can ascribe to this that he was the first pope. That just doesn't work. Besides, we didn't have popes until 300 anyway. What Matthew does not tell us, but we know from other Gospels, is that Jesus was sending them out 2 by 2, indicating the teams are the obvious choice for ministry. Jesus wasn't sending them out 1 by 1, cover more territory that way, right? But no, he was sending them out 2 by 2 because teamwork is the way to do ministry. You should never do ministry by yourself. It's always in a team. So we move into a section now where Jesus sends out the 12 apostles. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost house of Israel. When we compare Matthew's gospel to Mark and Luke, we find that there was some time between the 12 being specifically grouped together and Jesus sending them out. So Matthew has compressed what appears like compressed the time a little because he's telling a story. He's making sure that we understand Jesus was establishing himself as Messiah, and then he was sending out Messiah's representatives. So he wasn't necessarily giving us a concise point-by-point history. He was telling a story. So the 12 were sent out. First, in verse 5, take notice of the words sent out. Anybody have any guess what that word is? I said earlier that Matthew called those 12 the noun apostles. This is the verbal form of it. This is the verb form of apostle, sent out. Matthew's saying Jesus had appointed his 12 apostles and now was sending them out on an apostolic mission. It just reconfirms that they are commissioned by Jesus to go out in his name. Jesus also gives specific instructions on where to go and where not to go. I love this. A lot of people think that this is pretty subjective, pretty selective. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter only the town, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Don't go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. Go only to Jews. That doesn't sound like the gospel message, does it? Because we're to reach everybody, right? Jesus was telling his disciples, first, go to the target-rich environment of the Jews. I am the Messiah, King of the Jews, and your mission, your apostolic mission, sent out in my authority and my power, is to tell the Jews, I am here and I am the Messiah. Why did he give them power over the physical and the spiritual world? Because that's what the Messiah does. And they were his representative. And so the world needed to see them as the representative. He was sending out his first direct representative, his ambassadors, the apostles, to aid in spreading the message of the kingdom. Jesus is still at the point of offering the millennial kingdom to the people. Jesus gave the apostles specific instructions. In verse 5, we read that Jesus sent them out and giving them instructions. The word instructing needs to be seen here as having greater force and weight than simply teaching. This particular word carries the weight of ordering them, of commanding them. Jesus didn't give them some suggestions here. These were orders. Don't you dare go to anybody other than the Jews. That's the instructions he's giving right then. These were direct orders of people under his authority to work in his authority. Jesus' order for the apostles not to go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans was not because they could not be saved or were not part of God's redemptive plan. That's not what's being said here. But rather because God's plan was to offer first to Israel and then to the Gentiles. The Apostle Paul, who I remind you was not part of this original group of apostles, would later write, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentiles." Jesus was still in the phase of offering the kingdom of Israel, or kingdom to Israel. Jesus says, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's really an interesting statement to me. The lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus, as the shepherd, is looking for those sheep that have wandered off or been carried off. He was providing the lost sheep an opportunity to come back to the sheepfold. The message being delivered to Israel by Jesus was that your king is right here. Jesus saying, I'm right here, right now. Come follow me. The message of the kingdom was truly a message only for Israel. They were ones that were seeking the Messiah. Israel's history was one looking toward the Messiah. And the Messiah was standing right there, performing messianic miracles. And they didn't see him. Jesus goes on to say, and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The message they were to spread was the king and his kingdom were right here, right now. That indeed is the gospel message. The king of the universe is right here, right now. And he goes on to say, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. Jesus now gets a little more specific in his commands. The king and his kingdom are right here, right now. And to authenticate your message, go ahead and raise the dead and heal the sick. Cleanse the lepers. Do all of that. Authenticate that you're my representatives. Matthew spends 3 chapters telling us that that's what Jesus did. And now he sends them out so that the people would say, hey, isn't that what Jesus did? Oh, you guys are from Jesus. I get it. See, he's equating them together. The apostles doing those things would be authenticating themselves as his representatives, representatives of the Messiah that Israel was looking for. They come talking about the kingdom, doing things that they were looking for in the Messiah. It showed who they really were. It was giving Israel a glimpse of the Messiah. Then Jesus gives some additional instructions. Acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or staff, for the laborer deserves his food. Then Jesus instructs them on the financial end of their ministry. Remember here, instructed means commanded. So Jesus is commanding them to take no money from anyone for healing, casting out demons, cleansing from leprosy or whatever. Don't do this for pay. Do this for ministry. It's not about getting rich. It's about serving the king. There's also a sense that Jesus was setting them up for some lessons in dependency on him. Trusting him, having faith in him. I was talking with Tony Webb this week. It seems like some of the funding for their ministry may be going away. And when he first told me that, I thought, wow, this is going to be really interesting. But Tony was perfectly at ease with it. because he's trusting God. He's trusting God to make up the difference in the money that the funding that's not going to be there. Tony was trusting God to supply everything that he needed, and he wasn't worried about it in the least. He recognized that Jesus was setting the stage for him to be dependent and remain dependent on him. True faith in the right person is what Jesus is teaching there. Jesus told his apostles, don't even take a bag for your stuff, or don't take anything with you. Don't pack a bag with extra clothes. Just depend on God. Jesus wanted the apostles to focus on him and not their own needs. Jesus knew that if they depended on God, they would have the blessing of seeing him care for them in ways they could not even imagine. Now we get into some really nitty-gritty. In whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. Jesus also ordered the disciples to check out the town when they get there. Look for the most worthy person in town and stay with them. Don't go all around town. It was there were no Motel 6s to keep the light on. So when you traveled to another town, you had to depend on the hospitality of someone. As I was studying this, I looked closely at the word worthy here in our ESV text. The Greek word translated here as worthy has kind of a broad range of meaning. The best I could make out studying this word is that it means in this context properly fitting, corresponding to what should be expected, or perhaps which corresponds to one having repented. So think about that. Jesus says, whatever town or village you enter, find one who is a follower of Jesus and stay with them. Find someone that's a like mind. Find someone that's not going to work against you, but that's going to work with you in the ministry. Someone who already has become a follower of Jesus and is sympathetic to the mission. Jesus is instructing his apostles that they were to team up with people who support the mission they're on. That makes perfect sense. But it's not necessarily humanly intuitive. Even though the Apostle Paul was not part of this first group of apostles, it was a lesson he learned and practiced in his ministry. Where did Paul go first in a town? To the synagogue, where people were already at least predisposed to Jehovah God, if not already followers. There is also good indication that Peter and the other apostles did the same thing. Then Jesus says, as you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. So when you get to town, look around, scope it out, see who's there. Find somebody of like mind. And when you get into their house, greet them and offer your peace upon them. I believe Jesus is using the common etiquette of the day to reflect on the kindness and hospitality of the house owner in response to the person being a Jesus follower. The idea of peace here is not simply the lack of hostility or tranquility. It is more an expression of blessing upon the house that was custom for travelers to bring upon a house that would put them up. When you go into a house, you would offer a kind of a prayer of blessing on the house. And as you left, you would offer a prayer of blessing on them for caring for you. A prayer of blessing, Jesus is telling them for them to offer from the King that sent the teams on his ministry trip. If they accept you, pray for them a prayer of blessing from God. So when you travel and you get to someone's house, offer them a prayer of blessing because they've accepted you. And if they don't accept you, take your prayer back, put your stuff in the bag, and leave. That's what Jesus is telling them. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. I love this picture. But it makes no sense if you don't know some of the historical context that it comes from. It was clear from several passages in the Psalms, Isaiah and 2 Samuel, as well as other passages, that dirt is a sign of being unclean. It's a sign of the uncleanness of the world. It was a common practice for the Jews to shake off Gentile dirt when they got to the border. So as they were about to step from Gentile dirt into Israel dirt, same dirt, but one was clean and one wasn't, they would stop at the border and knock the dust off their shoes and get no Gentile dirt into Israel. And so Jesus here is just building on that. If you're not accepted, if they won't listen to the gospel message of the kingdom, shake off the dust from your feet and leave that house or town. If they're not going to listen to what you have to say about who is the Messiah, then just disregard them. Pack your bag and get out of town. Later on we'd read, don't cast your pearls before swine. I guess that was earlier we read that. Jesus would say, don't constantly give the gospel to people that are just going to throw it in your face. Wait until they're ready. And that's what Jesus is saying here. So we come to the last verse of this section. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. What town? The town that rejected the gospel. What town was that? Just about every town in Israel. There is Jesus the Messiah standing right there, right before them, and they all said no. Now, they would say yes for a while, as late as 4 days before his crucifixion. They would welcome him as Messiah into Jerusalem, and 4 days later, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Here in verse 15, Jesus tells the apostolic teams that those homes and towns that reject the kingdom message will have a difficult future. Jesus begins with truly. It's the Greek word amen. We normally put it at the end. But Jesus here is saying, hey, listen, what I'm about to say is really important. It's really important that you understand that it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. What happened to them, by the way? Yeah, fire and brimstone, and God just destroyed them, right? And that's better than what's going to happen for the towns in Israel that reject those apostolic teams. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. It's better to be burned up by fire and brimstone raining down from heaven and destroying everybody that's in there than it is for the towns that reject Jesus. What exactly is Jesus saying here? Homes or towns that rejected Jesus, reject the Messiah, would have a harder time than Sodom and Gomorrah. That's just almost an incomprehensible statement. So knowing that most towns and homes in Israel did reject Messiah, what was their punishment? Well, 40 years later, Jerusalem was completely destroyed and their temple was destroyed. They ceased to be a national people and were scattered all over the world. Not to be a country again until May 1948, after 6 million Jews were killed in World War II and millions more killed in Rome and the other people that occupied the Levant for the next 1900 years. What's the punishment for rejecting the Messiah? At least 1900 years of obscurity, of not having a home, of being the most hated people on earth. You realize that today the United Nations, for every good edict they pass 3 against Israel? This tiny little country that doesn't do anything to anyone unless attacked is the constant recipient of missiles. Every day, 200 or 300 missiles and rockets land in Israel. And what's the United Nations do? Do they punish Gaza and the Islamic people? No, they punish Israel for retaliating to having if a rocket landed in Fort Myers sent by Cuba, we'd go down there and make Cuba glass. And rightfully so. But Israel can't do that because they get punished every time. What is the result of it being more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town? Is you will be nothing for at least 1900 years and until the Lord returns, until the Messianic kingdom happens. What happens to towns and homes that reject the Messiah? It's worse than the sudden destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah experienced. It's a life of opposition. It's a life of struggle. Where school children in Israel have to know where the gas mask is and they can get to it in 15 seconds. I can't imagine living in that fear. Where every home has to have a gas-tight, an airtight fallout shelter because of Scud missiles. Worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus is giving the apostolic teams a glimpse into what the world would be like in the future, including our day. So what's the conclusion? We've seen Jesus appoint 12 of his disciples to be apostles. We've seen these apostles were his direct representatives sent out with his authority and his power to the towns and homes mostly in the Galilee region. Jesus gave them some strict commands. Don't go into somebody that's not going to accept you. Don't stay if they reject you. Don't pack a bag. Trust me. As apostles, they were representatives of Jesus, the Messiah, the King, and representatives of his kingdom. Everything they did and every place they went, they would be his representatives. Sitting around the campfire talking about their day's activities, they were still his representatives. When they got together, they were his representatives. When they were sent out, they were his representatives. Every part of their day, they were his representatives. Okay, 1900 years later. The same thing is true. We are still his representatives. Everything we do, everything we say, every stupid post that you post on Facebook or like that somebody else says that's really obnoxious reflects on Jesus. That's the reality of the world we live in. You are always going to be a representative of Jesus. Of course, the message is a little different. We're not offering the kingdom, as it were, the Messianic kingdom like that, but the offer is still the same. The only way you get to participate in the Messianic kingdom in the church is to be part of the church and to come back with him and rule with him. And that's the message we're teaching, that we're spreading. We don't know when the literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus will come. We just don't know. It may begin today. Well, the tribulation may begin today. Jesus may take us home today, and we get to party with Jesus for 7 years. And then the Messianic kingdom comes, and we go to work with Jesus for 1,000 years. I don't know when that's going to happen. I wish I knew by what means and what that would look like. But what's really important is that the only way I can participate in the kingdom is to be a follower of Jesus today. I also know that that Jewish homes and towns that rejected the Messiah, standing in front of them and continue to have rejected him, now have a really difficult time. Israel is one of the least theistic countries in the Middle East. That's saying a lot. They have rejected Jesus, and as a result, it's worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. Separated from God for eternity is what rejection of the Messiah looks like. We are to present the gospel to all who will listen, and those who reject, we are to knock the dust off their homes, off the feet of from their homes, and continue to homes and towns that will accept the Messiah. This doesn't mean we give up on those people and towns. It just means we continue to pray and we go on to the next until the Lord sends us back to them. The bottom line is is that we have been commissioned by Jesus with his authority and his power that he's given to the church through the Holy Spirit to go out and present the gospel. That means it's our job to put ourselves in a position to reach out to others, to call others, to visit a dying friend in the hospital or in hospice, and to make sure they know and have a true relationship with Jesus. To help people that need help, to invite friends to come to movie nights, to invite people to church, all the things that being a good gatherer for Jesus is. Father, my prayer is that we take a look at what you're doing and where you're doing it, to examine if we are being good representatives of you and Jesus, to see if we're operating in your power, accomplishing the good works you've established for us. Thank you, Father, for calling us to be your slaves, to represent you to the lost and dying world around us. Thank you, Father, for all that you are and all that you do. In Jesus' name. Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.